We'll get a big test on Friday with the jobs numbers, but it seems like the U.S. economy is starting to pick up a little bit of steam as we head into 2012. Joined now by Steve Dubner. He is the co-author of the Freakonomics books and the blogs of the same name. Steve, the president, obviously, he's out there saying things are getting better. We got to stay on the same path. Give me another 4 years. The Republicans are saying it's been a disaster. Something you've analyzed, does it matter who the president is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters a lot on a lot of different levels. And I'll be honest, if I were President Obama, I'd be saying exactly what he's saying. If I were Mitt Romney or the other Republicans, I'd be saying exactly what I'm saying too. The fact of the matter, however, is that the president generally matters so much less than we think. And especially when it comes to the economy.
I think that's the point. He matters for international issues and the culture of the country and things like that. But it's an economic cycle, right? And you might come in at a point like Bill Clinton when the economy was about to take off and then he got a lot of credit, or when things were about to go south.
That's exactly right. I mean, if you're, let's say, a Democrat, and you want to make the argument that the Obama administration has done everything it can and has mattered a lot and is trying to turn things around, you could say, if I want to play devil's advocate, I'd say, well, for the money that you've spent, the degree of unemployment that you've lowered is pathetic. And if I were looking at ROI on dollars spent, so you've got a Paul Krugman type who says, the problem is the stimulus should have been triple.
They should have spent more, right? Exactly.
And then you'd see the needle really move. Maybe, everybody, these predictions are total hocus pocus essentially, because nobody knows. It's really hard to test these things. It's not like the stock market where you can back test 100 incidents. We have one economy and one time series, which is U.S. history. So every time somebody says the last time we had a recession like this, we did this and this happened, it's a very hard argument to make. What I will say is that when I've talked to people who have worked in the White House, so I've talked to Austin Goolsbee, who was a past chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I talked to Don Rumsfeld, the other side of the aisle, who worked closely with many presidents and has also been a CEO of a couple companies. They will admit with no reservations the president's influence on the economy is, almost vanishingly small. Rumsfeld, I want to read you something if you don't mind. I asked Rumsfeld, I asked him, how much does the president matter generally? And he said, the president matters a great deal. Look at what presidents throughout history have accomplished. And you can't disagree with that. Then I asked him what about compared to, let's say, a CEO? And you, Mr. Rumsfeld, have been a CEO. He said, in business, conversely, I could go into a corporation and decide that I want to freeze the dividend, and I could do it. I could decide that I'm going to open a research facility in country X instead of Y, and I do it. On the other hand, if you want to do something as president, you put something in place in one of the departments or agencies. Here we go. The Congress wants to have hearings on it. They want to pull the plant up by the roots every 5 minutes to see if it's still growing and traumatize it. And the press wants to critique it before it's even 15 minutes old. It's not an environment. We talk about president as CEO. It just doesn't work.
Right. He certainly doesn't have unilateral power. But what about the idea that do regulations matter? Because one of the complaints you hear a lot, certainly from the president's opponents, is that there's too much regulation and it's crippling American business.
I'll tell you what I think, and this is more opinion than anything, because it's very hard to say for me empirically. I think regulations grow out of Washington's frustration with how little it can actually control the economy. And so I think it uses regulations, and I think increasingly we're seeing it use tax policy to do things to the economy that it thinks it should be able to do through legislation but can't.
That's a great point. We were talking about that before he came on camera. The president today is supposed to put some meat on the bone of his new plan to help Americans who are underwater refinance their mortgage, potentially through a tax on the big banks. Is that smart policy, smart economics?
I don't know. Look, I'm neither an economist nor a policy guy. I try to look at things as empirically as possible, but also try to understand the psyche of why these guys are making these moves. I'd probably be advising him to do the same. I could think of a number of ways in which it could backfire. I mean, banks are big job creators. Banks have a lot of shareholders. Banks are, big real estate consumers. There are a lot of ways in which you could argue.
And if banks have to spend more tax, I'm not going to here to defend the banks, but if they got to pay higher tax, that's that much less capital they have to do lending, which they're not doing now, but theoretically they could be doing.
Yeah, right. You could argue less capital. On the other hand, you could argue that there's all that capital now that's not going anywhere. I think the biggest issue that you hear from everyone, which I would argue is probably true, is uncertainty is really bad for the human condition. Humans don't operate well under uncertainty. This is a complaint that's probably coming more from small business people and the Republicans than Democrats now. But when the goalposts get shifted every few months, whether it's on healthcare policy or tax policy, that is disturbing to people psychically. Forget about economically, psychically. And one reaction that people have under uncertainty is to say, you know what, I'm going to stop. I'm going to dig in my heels and believe what I believe and do what I do, because it is too frustrating for me to try to figure out where these guys are going and how I'm going to respond to that. And I think that's what we've seen. That's why a lot of capital is sitting around both on the employment side and on the investment side.
That's a great point, but I know if he was here, my colleague Henry Blodgett would say there's always uncertainty. So how can business, oh, there's too much uncertainty. When is there ever certainty?
Because I would argue that the political stage that we're in right now is equivalent to a market stage where the VIX is very, very, very high. So we know that when the VIX is up, that investors go a little bit nuts. They do a lot of things that in the light of day they wish they hadn't done. And I think when we're in a political stage where the political equivalent, the PIX or whatever, is high, you see a lot of people do things that in the light of day or 4 years later, 8 years later, when it's a different politician's turn to try to clean up the mess, they wish that their predecessors hadn't done.
So now why do I think in one of your next blogs you're going to have a PIX indicator that's going to map this all out?
Not a bad idea.
All right, Stephen, thanks very much.
My pleasure.